Today, we are physically dispersed. We gather virtually. So, I would like us to take a moment together to reflect the meaning of place. In doing so, we recognise the various traditional lands from which we join together today. We acknowledge the elders, past and present, of all the land on which we work and live, and listen to their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. We acknowledge these unceded lands and the ongoing connection to lands, sea and community. For this is and always will be Aboriginal land. Please now take a moment to join me in acknowledging the traditional lands that you are on and respectfully honour the custodians who continue to care for country.
He honore, he karoria, he maungarongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tāngata katoa. Huri no mai tēnei pito, ki tēnā pito, ki tērā pito, ki ngā tāngata whenua o te ao. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a great honour on behalf of Māori here in Aotearoa to acknowledge us all and the sovereign unceded lands we stand on, the waters, mountains and forests that sustain us, the ancestors whose dreams have inspired us, and the future generation for whose rights we fight. How wonderful it is to be gathered together for another Lime connection, albeit electronically, in this really extraordinary time in world history that we find ourselves in. May our connection be fun and fabulous, authentic and creative, powerful and provocative, healing and radical. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Good morning, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this session of the Lime Conference, Staying Connected. My name's Sean Ewan and I'm currently based in Melbourne on the land of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to elders past and present on Wurundjeri country here. Thank you for our recorded introductions and welcomes and acknowledgements of country. We've got a great panel today, and to pick up Paparangi's prompt, we want to be authentic and creative. So please, as we get underway in conversation, send in your questions. I note from our list of panelists that we've got people from the far west, that is in Perth, all the way across the world. And I want to acknowledge and mention the fact that many of us are actually in lockdown at the moment, at least in Australia and New Zealand, and how difficult that is for some people. So I hope this is a fantastic session that puts your mind elsewhere for a little while. I have the job of doing a little bit of housekeeping first. So to start with, the session will be recorded and will be available for viewing later. I'm sure you all know where your fire exits are, depending on where you're actually staying and living. So I'll leave that to you, as well as the bathrooms. The conversations and the questions will be respectful and moderated, and we know that, and we thank you for participating in that way. Can I make mention of the late Dennis McDermott and the Memorial Award for Excellence in Cultural Safety? That award and those applications are now open and can be accessed via the Lime Connection website. After we've finished the formal part of the conversation, there will be what's called an open Zoom to chat and network and reflect on the session and to talk about other things as may suit you. And they won't be monitored conversations. You can get on and chat with your buddies as you would at morning tea. Please share on your social media sites hashtag Lime Staying Connected and starting to build up a community of connection across the globe. particularly as we're particularly disconnected at this point in time. If you have any difficulties with connections and participating, please contact the Lime team via email. They'll be monitoring their emails during the session and we'll be able to help you as well. And as I started with, please post in your questions in the Q&A function and they'll be fed through to the panel and we can engage in as engaged a conversation as we actually can. I won't be going through the bios of our participants. They'll do that themselves and they can do that certainly better than I can. But we've got a fantastic panel, as I said, from across the Pacific and from North and South America, although Amalia has headed north up into North America. But she probably needs a little introduction to most of you, but can we start with our dear friend, Associate Professor Martina Kamaka. Martina, can you introduce yourself, please? And as you do, can you also share with us some of the important things about how Indigenous medical education networks have impacted on your work and your approach? Thanks, Martina.
Aloha e nā kua, aloha e nā aumakua, aloha e nā kupuna, aloha kākou. Aloha, my name is Martina Lealoha Kamaka. Would like to introduce myself in a more of an Indigenous way initially. I hail from the island of Oahu, the ahupua'a of Kaneohe. You can see my ahupua'a behind me on my screenshot. So that is my land. My mountain there, Lanihuli, and it stretches all the way to the Pacific, which is the body of water that touches all of our lands that are here on this panel. My family comes from not only the island of Oahu, but I also have genealogy that goes back to Waihe'e Maui and Kohala on the Big Island of Hawaii. My Western introduction, I am a family physician. I trained at the John A. Burns School of Medicine. I currently am an associate professor in the Department of Native Hawaiian Health. My work really, after I was in private practice and I went to the university, my work is really focused on what we call cultural competency training. I know it's not a great term, and I understand there are better terms, but that's the world that I'm in and the world of grants, and everybody understands that, as well as Indigenous health. As part of my work at the university, I got involved with the Ahahui o Nakauka, the Association of Native Hawaiian Physicians. It was through the Ahahui o Nakauka, and as we were trying to form that, we reached out to Te Ora, who for advice on how do we start this Indigenous Medical Physicians Association. So they invited us down to Aotearoa. At the same time, AIDA was also going through a formation process, and AIDA showed up in Aotearoa as well. And from that initial gathering, some wonderful friends were made, realized that we all shared similar stories, similar challenges, and we continued that connection. And at our next meeting in Stradbroke Island, North Stradbroke Island in Australia, we decided that we really needed a formal gathering for Indigenous physicians, and that was the origins of PRIDOC, the Pacific Region Indigenous Doctors Congress. This meeting occurs almost every 2 years. I'm excited, next July we'll be in Vancouver. But out of PRIDOC, we had a track on medical education because most of us that were organizing that first PRIDOC came from the medical education world. So we knew we needed a medical education track. And it was in that involvement of a medical education track in PRIDOC, which moved around every 2 years around the Pacific to different countries, that I was able to make connections with not only Dr. Sean Ewan and Melbourne, but also with Suzanne Pitama down in Otago and Christchurch, as well as Papa Rangi Reed, who did the welcome from Aotearoa. And through those connections from PRIDOC, I was able to join the LIME network. And so I've been a proud participant of LIME for every one you've had except the very first one. So, and it was really with that work with LIME that we started sort of formal educator and student exchanges as well. And that's where I was able to learn more in depth what people were doing, because I would come and they were coming to Hawaii and we were able to share. And I have to admit that I did change a lot of my teaching based on lessons that I learned from all my colleagues in Australia and New Zealand. So for me, this whole idea of networking is so powerful. It's definitely impacted our work and made it so much bigger, better, so much stronger, and so much more relevant, not only for our Indigenous students, but for all of our students. So mahalo nui loa for giving me this opportunity to introduce myself and address that first question.
Thanks so much, Martina, and we'll come back to some of the points that you raised when we've finished our introductions. Amalia, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. So hello, everybody, and good afternoon for me. So my name is Amalia Pesantes. I am a Peruvian medical anthropologist currently based in Pennsylvania in the United States. I have been working on Indigenous health issues for the last 15 years, specifically looking at Indigenous initiatives to fight for the recognition of the Indigenous medical practices in governmental health facilities. Specifically one great initiative where the Indigenous organization from the Peruvian Amazon trained young Indigenous people in both Western and Indigenous medicine, and they are all of them, like 60 of them are currently working in primary healthcare facilities. Because of that work, I was contacted by Ian Anderson, like I think it was 2016, to be part of the effort of writing the article for the Lancet about the status of Indigenous health in different parts of the world. And based on that experience, I then applied for a postdoctoral opportunity at the University of Melbourne, where I met Sean when I got to know the LIME network. And for me, it was very eye-opening to see, you know, the way in which in Australia, New Zealand, and other countries, you were, you know, incorporating Indigenous medical education into the curricula. That is something that we do not have in my country, in Peru. However, of course, the Ministry of Health recognizes the need of having our healthcare professionals aware and prepared to be able to provide what we call intercultural health, you know, in Indigenous areas that mostly live in rural areas. Just to give you a context, in Peru, 25% of the population self-identifies as Indigenous. And from the Peruvian Amazon, it's 2%. Most of the Indigenous people live in the Andean region, so the highland. And for me, you know, learning and being connected with the LIME network was very important to make me aware of the different ways in which people in different parts of the world are making an effort to ensure that health professionals who are going to provide care for Indigenous populations are prepared and are respectful and are aware of the, you know, the people and the culture they are going to be working on. And I'm going to be talking about this later, but it was also being part of this network also enabled me to get a sense of the different things that were being done during COVID in relationship to putting upfront the relevance of Indigenous medical practices to face the challenges brought by COVID-19 to Indigenous populations. So hello everybody, and thank you for being here. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Amalia. You've just recently moved from Peru, so thanks for making the time to connect in today when I'm sure you're in a state of some chaos, having moved countries as well. Can we move a little further north and ask Mary if you would introduce yourself and address the opening question, Mary? Thank you.
Sure.
Boujou, Trudash Bukhat to Asak, Wushkitan, Nahat Site, Hetidach, Ayhat Akwandach, Ayhat. My Clinket, I'm from the Wushkita or the Thunderbird House of the Shark clan. It looks like my glasses are quite blurry or shine a lot. I'm from the Thunderbird House of the Shark clan of the Akwon tribe of the Tlingit Nation of Southeast Alaska, way on the Pacific coast of the United States. But I want to thank and acknowledge the Dakota and Anishinaabe people on whose land I live and work now in the middle of the United States in Minnesota. Regarding the question, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota Medical School, and when I came here from after working full scope family medicine for my tribe in Alaska for about 11 years, and then they asked me to come and teach here, which seems like a great opportunity to do more or a broader movement, because on my own tribe, I tried forever to get, for my own tribe, I tried to get the people who were leading the programs to recognize the impact of social determinants on the health of my population or our population, and they refused to. If they're on here, so be it. But they just wanted us basically to stay on the rat wheel and just see patients. But I knew that there needed to be something more that I could do, and moved to the university, and there was asked to teach Indigenous health. Dr. Melissa Lewis was already there, and she, unbeknownst to me, took some of the LIME curriculum, modeled the LIME curriculum into an Indigenous curriculum for our school at the University of Minnesota. I don't in this country of a medical school to use, to require the Indigenous health curriculum, but I know that we're one of the very few now who do. And she left a couple of years after starting it, and I've been teaching it for the last few years. When I first got to the medical school, though, I looked up immediately Indigenous health curriculum and found LIME, and was just overwhelmed by what was already out there, and definitely have continued to model our curriculum now at our medical school after it. I'm also the president, though, of this Association of American Indian Physicians, and I think it's really important, especially the United States, as people know, like in much of the world, but particularly in the United States, we've also gone through a racial reckoning here, where there's a lot more attention now being paid to what's happening to Indigenous people, to African-American people, Asian people, different people in our countries, thank goodness. And part of that is pushing for more of us in academia, but also pushing for more of our curriculum. So now is our opportunity. And as I learned more about LIME, I also learned about PRIDOC and all the other efforts that, you know, I joked in the beginning of this before we even started about being US-centric. We definitely tend to be here, and not on so many different issues. And this is one of them. We're not even aware. I wasn't aware until starting academia and looking around, doing some more research about what's already there. So to me, it seems clear that we have a lot in the United States. We have a lot of catching up to do. And I'm just so happy that this Indigenous network exists, so that we don't have to, you know, we don't have to start from scratch. We can just join you guys, pick up what you've already done, and which we're planning on doing for a national Indigenous curriculum. We just met 2 weeks ago to take some of the work that you've already done, reframe it for our own country and needs, and go from there. So I can't imagine having to do this without knowing that this was already in place. And I want to thank you all for having worked so hard to put it there, and look forward to working more with all of you in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mary. I'll be interested to ask a bit more about the national curriculum that you're working on, and hear more about that shortly if we can. Danielle, can we ask you to introduce yourself and respond to the opening question, please?
Absolutely. Well, good evening and good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Danielle Soucy, and I'm very happy to be talking to you this evening from the unceded territory of the Wolastoq people here in the most eastern point of Canada. This land is unceded and protected by peace and friendship treaties. I have been working for Indigenous peoples organizations for about 20 years. And as a settler, it's quite an honor to be able to learn from and participate in this work. I'm currently the Executive Director for the National Consortium for Indigenous Medical Education, which is really exciting because this is the first of its kind in Canada. And it has, if you look up our executive, what I call the dream team of Indigenous medical educators in the country, working together to bring about some pretty fantastic change for the 17 medical schools we have here in Canada. We have key stakeholders, and I think when I think about networks, I think sort of nationally, Canada, as you know, has First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We try to work distinctions-based. We're trying to create this space where we all come together and understand what the priorities are for medical learners and Indigenous faculty in medicine, and how can we achieve those goals. So by establishing this consortium and with the key stakeholders of the regulatory bodies, we're seeing a direct move forward in this work. We're very excited. We are in our infancy. We really just started going about 4 months ago, but we're well on our way. In terms of Lyme and PRIDOC, those organizations, these networks have been really important for us to understand each other and learn from each other. So it's about understanding different practices, finding those commonalities that tend to emerge when the older people speak, where when the young and the students speak, they tend to have these shared experiences that are reiterated across the globe within Indigenous communities, and in particular in medicine, that we can bring together. I know, so the more rewarding aspect of networking, I think, is for the learners. Having been privileged to attend many Lyme conferences or connections and bringing students with me, they are transformed by what they hear. Their direction changes. Many would be maybe interested in med ed, and maybe interested in this, but after Lyme, they're lifted up, they're bolstered up, they find safe spaces, and for them, they're like, you know, I want to be a member of Lyme, I want to go to PRIDOC, I want to make sure I'm part of the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada. So they're really gung-ho, and I think we're seeing that. I won't call them old, but our executives, the more senior experienced scholars, now mentoring in this new cohort of young professionals and students. So networking and being able to connect with the people here and now on this panel has really benefited, I think, myself personally as a worker and a researcher and a learner, and definitely the nation as a whole, and being able to test with each other and laugh with each other to learn about what's working and what can we do. So thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
Thanks, Danielle. And who would have thought when we first met as a Lyme network, the one where we missed you, Martina, you must have turned up late, in Fremantle, that in 2021 we'd be talking about almost intergenerational support across the network, and seeing these networks grow in different ways in different countries. There's a bunch of themes that emerged out of just the introductions, which was for me around medical education and curriculum, medical practice, recognition of Indigenous knowledges in both medical practice and in the curriculum. The research that's been done, and reference to the Lancet article that some of you were engaged with, of course, the current pandemic, and thinking about the greater visibility over the last 12 to 18 months of Black Lives Matter, and that's the impact of that in a different jurisdiction. So I'm going to pick up a few of those themes as we go through. Martina, if I could come back to you first, and I was just interested in asking you to unpack a little bit more specifically, how have networks, be it Lyme or PRIDOC that you particularly mentioned, impacted on the work at John Burns Medical School, and perhaps could give us a key example of that?
How it impacted the work at John Burns, I think there's several examples I can think of, but I think most importantly is because John Burns School of Medicine sits in the middle of the Pacific, and they want to consider themselves an institution of higher learning that, some excellence within the Pacific, it's a lot easier to go to them and say, hey, there's this interesting program happening in Australia, there's this interesting program happening in New Zealand, I'd like to check it out. And so I have to be honest in saying that I have had support from higher ups because of that. My boss, even the dean. In fact, it's interesting, the dean has met Dr. Melissa Lewis at a meeting, and then Dr. Melissa Lewis has told the dean about working with us and the impact it's had on her work, and then he comes back all excited. And so that makes it really, it makes it a lot easier for us to maintain certain programs. You know, budgets are always a huge issue at university. So the dean has protected our immersion budget, which has been a big part of our program for many years. The faculty have been very open to expanding the Indigenous health curriculum. Now, unlike Aotearoa and Australia, and I suspect in the I suspect this is the case for the US mainland, we don't have, like pediatrics has a protected time, you know, all the different pathology, histology, they run longitudinally, and we have to kind of insert ourselves in different places in different years. So that's, so I must say, because of the exposure to Lyme, our faculty going to Lyme, coming back, being excited about it, and pride of that, the general medical education faculty has been much more open to allowing us to insert more of our curriculum. So it's been a little easier. We're actually shifting now into small group learning community type teaching. And so within learning communities, we're actually integrating culture and community. And so we're actually being asked to be the consultants as the School of Medicine shifts their curricular focus to a different type of teaching and learning. And I really have to say it's been made much easier because of these connections and awareness of the work that's happening elsewhere. And I think Danielle talked about it, you know, the students and the faculty, everybody comes back all, you know, we're all uplifted, we're all invigorated. And I think that's one of the values of these Indigenous networks is that we support each other. You know, sometimes the work gets really hard. And when we get to connect with each other, we just kind of relight our fire, and it gives us that motivation to keep going. So that's sort of the other aside that I think is really neat that I wanted to share.
Thanks, Martina. And does anyone else on the panel want to share an example of what Martina described in terms of, if you like, the power or the leverage of international relationships to progress your own work?
I want to say that when I have been talking about Lyme and the fact that it's been going on for 20 years and that it's been instated in the schools for 10 years in New Zealand and Australia, that's powerful. So I was able to go to the AAMC, Association of American Medical Colleges, and they said, wow, as well. And they are actually helping us to build this national curriculum that hopefully we'll be able to push. But it's because of that long standing network of folks. Also, I totally agree, Martina. Right now, particular with the world burning around us, we need these friendships to help us not melt into despair. So.
Thanks, Mary. Danielle or Amalia, do you want to comment on the power of the global to progress your own stuff or not?
Yeah, certainly. The leverage has been really important, whether in the new role or previously working at one particular med school, to be able to say you're part of this network and that what you're trying to change that seems radical to them has actually been implemented in other countries with shared histories. It carries a lot of power. So, you know, this, you know, saying Lyme alone is a very magical, powerful thing to use to gain leverage for change. And it's also a great, again, to go back to the students, it's a great way to say you're not alone in this, and there's a world for you to connect with and stay connected with.
I just want to complement with some thoughts regarding when I learned about Lyme, because I didn't know about Lyme when I went to when I applied to the postdoc, it was actually Sean who introduced it to me. And the more I learned, I realized, wow, you know, they are doing such great things. And there are things that we could learn in Latin America about this effort. But I also realized the language barrier, you know, and because in Latin America, we are also producing great things and conceptualizations about the challenges of providing, you know, care for Indigenous people. But because most of the literature will be in Spanish, and most of the literature, you know, that comes from Australia, from Canada, from the US is in English, you know, and we talk about the same things, but we use different terms. And there are, of course, some nuances regarding, you know, based on the colonial experience, which is very different, and also based on the proportion of Indigenous population that are, you know, that represent the total population of the countries. But that is something that stayed with me, and that makes it so important to be part of this network, because it makes me realize that we need to start building networks, because there are things to learn from both sides of the world regarding what is being done to improve Indigenous health. Thank you.
Thanks, Amalia. And Martina, I recall, I think it must have been a conference in Sydney where we both started talking about Indigenous simulated patients at the same time, and the value in trying to have a connected up approach to how you might consider what were the key issues you were trying to progress through Indigenous simulated patients in medical education. Mary, I was interested, and I was going to come back and ask you, and you mentioned it again. Can you tell us a bit more about the national Indigenous curriculum that's being developed, and what the structures are that are supporting that across the US?
Sure. I want to comment though on what on Amalia's words though, and say that I think another value that I get out of these networks is that so often in medicine I feel like I've lost myself to medicine because it's so overwhelming. And what I love about these networks is it allows us to connect to other things that we're interested in life, like the struggles that our comrades are having, well, it's the wrong word, sorry, that our friends and other Indigenous people are having around the world. Like when I think of what's happening in the Amazon and different areas that people are struggling with. So that's a nice part of the networks. Regarding the national curriculum, we just actually met for the first time 2 weeks ago. And again, it's supported by the Association of American Indian Physicians and the Association of American Medical Colleges, coming together to take some of the work that you've done with Lyme and build a curriculum that's available to all medical schools. Now, I think it'll be another, I'm being pessimistic, another 20 years before we're able to do what you did and get it implemented in all the medical schools. But if we can at least get it implemented in the schools where there are significant populations of us, in those areas, then that would be a great success. Lots of us, again, not lots, a few of us now are doing our own curriculums, but wouldn't it be nice if we had a universal one that schools that aren't as familiar could turn to? Because we have those universal international themes, like you just hinted at, Sean, with the Indigenous patient. You know, we have some commonalities that like the respect of the elders and community before individualism, blah, 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 that we all know and love and respect. So that's where our efforts are. They're very new. I'm hoping that this will be something that we succeed, at least get on print and out to colleges in the United States, at least the mainland and Alaska. Hawaii doesn't need any help, obviously. Within the next year or so, and have some success afterwards.
Thanks, Mary. We can always improve. I do want to talk about a challenge about thinking about a national curriculum, which I think is so important. But and I think Mary alluded to this when she said it'll be 20 years. I mean, one of the issues that we face is that we have very, 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 not only do we have very, very small numbers of Indigenous physicians, we have even smaller numbers of Indigenous educators. And some of these topics are very difficult to teach about. And it's something you don't necessarily want to have a web-based learning. Sometimes you actually have to have discussion to fully engage in some of these really difficult topics, especially those around colonization, which means that part of that curriculum has to have training for faculty, because obviously there aren't enough of us to go around to do all the training. So we're going to have to train others and advocates. That means somebody has to put some money into it, which is always a big question, right? So I think getting buy-in from the AAMC is great, but then we actually need to get, one of the things that AAMC can do is make it a required part of accreditation of all medical schools. So if they do something like that, then medical schools will be forced to put some money into it. But that's the other issue is, I think, you know, we need training for more of us, then we need to train others, and then that stick to make them all do it. So
that's exactly right. The LCME doesn't even include us on for faculty when they list requirements for schools. So yeah, we have a long ways to go. I completely agree with you. We're going to need more than talk. We need money too. Yep. Thank you.
If I can jump in on this theme, you know, you talk about universal curriculum and the challenges, and I think that's what, you know, as NCIME, so the short form of our very long name, what we're trying to do is we have these 6-party working groups, right? One of them's curriculum. You know, we have anti-racism, we have assessment of Indigenous studies, culturally safe curriculum, admissions, transition, recruitment of Indigenous faculty, and then physician wellness and joy. And part of this is because there's a few people expected to do a lot of work. We have 17 medical schools. So how do we make it more uniform? How do we develop these tools and templates? And that's some of the things that we're focusing on with these working groups, is say, okay, enough, let's not duplicate. There's limited resources. So let's, you know, fund this one consortium, let us do some work and see where it goes. And so we're lucky that we are funded and that our stakeholders, for us, what's important is we have like the Royal College. So we have the postgrad, undergrad, the licensing, the Indigenous docs, and the examining groups, all part of the consortium. So now we're going to see this actually roll out. In Canada, we had RCAP in '85, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, that said, you know, education is important, not too much happened, right? Then we go down the road, we had Aboriginal Human Resource Initiative in 2010, roughly, for another 2005 to 2012, same idea, this conversation, but it gets stalled at the implementation. Then we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015. So now we're seeing that, okay, enough of the talk. Where's that action? We've learned, we've talked to. So this is what we're hoping for to achieve with this consortium, is this opportunity to have these sort of tools that the 17 schools can use, and they're backed by the right people, so that no more excuses. It's time for change, right? Where action is now. Thank you.
I think the consortium's a fascinating idea in terms of some of the challenges that I would observe in Australia, perhaps in New Zealand, in terms of the sector. And Danielle, could you, everything needs some leadership, and could you describe a bit about where the leadership for the consortium has come from and what some of the challenges there might be?
Yeah. What's really beautiful about this is it's Indigenous led. So our leadership is an executive council, and it's chaired by Dr. Marsha Anderson, who's quite known to many people, Evan Adams, Lisa Richardson, Sarah Funnell, Nell Wyman, and Darlene Kitty. So they've all been members of IPAC and led this work in Canada. So they're really leading the work. While we have sort of the 5 stakeholder regulatory bodies as part of the governing council for the consortium, they're really taking the cue from the Indigenous leadership, right? And we're having the elders and knowledge keepers circles. So they're the ones who are setting the tone. So it's the Indigenous physician, medical educators who are leading the work. And it is now the Royal College, the undergrad, postgrad saying, okay, how do we support you? We're going to listen now, and we're going to apply some, you know, critical race theory to ourselves, some anti-racism to ourselves. So it feels very different from sort of the same conversations that tend to happen over time, that it's really about that action piece. So it's no rehashing, It's no explaining why, it's how do we do this, right? And that's where we're at. And we're hoping, 3 years to come up with a broad range of tools, recognizing the distinctions in Canada, because we have First Nations, very distinct groups, Inuit and Métis, and geographies, recognizing that. And then, we have an election called suddenly, but hopefully in 3 years from now, we'll get more of that magical funding to really work with the schools to implement all these tools and say, okay, we've provided you with the Indigenous developed and led work, and let us help you implement it locally and how to adapt it to the community you're working with. So these are sort of the long-term visions, right? That's structural reform.
Thanks so much. Amalia, I'm thinking about your context in South America, and in your introduction, you talked about trying to support the recognition of some of the Indigenous medical practices as well. How do these ideas resonate for perhaps your context?
So one thing that is very interesting for me is also that when we talk about Indigenous efforts around the world, we also need to think about how would I say this, whether it's a high-income country, a middle-income country, or a low-income country. So in a place like Peru, where there's not enough doctors in general, not indigenous people alike, the amount of medical doctors, and physicians is very limited. So I always wonder whether the strategy that have been used in Australia that we are proposing in Canada and the US would be the most appropriate here. Because here, for example, most of the services are provided at primary healthcare facilities where there are no doctors, but actually what we call nurse technicians, which is a 3-year degree. So when the Indigenous organizations were thinking about, realized, okay, we're not going to be able to change the way medical education is being taught in Peru. Why don't we start with our own people who will be willing to work in these areas, even if it's with the 3-year degree? So that's how it started. So I think that what is interesting for me is to hear like the way we frame and the strategies that we choose to pursue have to be also relevant and contextualized. And one of the things I think is related with the budget allocated for health. I'm sure that having a universal health coverage also impacts the way that we can think about providing quality of care, like and culturally appropriate care for Indigenous people. So I think those are the things that come to my mind when I listen to these conversations. How to learn from each other, even if it's different, there are elements that we need to think and how to contextualize it to make it relevant.
Thanks, Amalia. As we go on to the conversation, please, if you've got questions, put them in the question box, and we'll challenge the panel with the questions. One of the things that we wanted to talk about that has been raised a bit more was the recognition of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous practice in what's fundamentally, not that they're fundamentally opposed, but the curricula that we teach into is primarily a Western biomedical framing. And I just wondered if the panel had some comments about how the global networks or your local networks have helped in terms of the recognition of Indigenous practice, health practice. Martina, can I start with you, please?
Sure. So it's a essential part of our curriculum to talk about the Hawaiian worldview of wellness. What is wellness? And the students can understand it because it's a very holistic view, right? But what we do is we take it a step further, and it's really that very close connection to land, your ancestors. So we take so mind, body, spirit model, and then we expand it out to a larger model that involves community, relationship to land, and relationship to wherever you get your spiritual sustenance from. And so we already ask them to think about health in that way. So you can't disconnect health from land or from family or community. It can't just be a one person in the office thing. Then the other thing that we think is really important for recognizing Indigenous knowledge is our Indigenous medical practices. So it's very important for us that our students are made aware of our Indigenous medical practices and that they understand that our people are using them. So I want them to at least have a basic understanding of what the main practices are so they can have a conversation with their patients to talk about it and figure out if they need to have a conversation with the healers as far as making sure that everything is going to turn out for the best, or we're doing the best for the patient. I think there's that recognition now with the world going through a lot of climate change and some of the things that are happening, that some of the answers to some of these challenges to our globe can be found in Indigenous knowledge. So we're actually starting to have that conversation at the medical school, and I think people are looking at that. It's that conversation is definitely happening in our community. So because it's out in the community, it's easy to bring it into the medical school. So just those are just a couple of examples.
And how do you think about, for the panel, how do you think about the challenges of a national curriculum, but as Martina, you talked about the locally based both Indigenous knowledges and your very strong connection with Indigenous patients or Native Hawaiian patients, Native Hawaiian knowledge. How do you think about that kind of challenge and tension? Mary?
You know, when we expand on this, or when we develop a national, it will be with the caveat that it's got to be in tune with the local. So you can take, Alaskans can take it, but they would make it more specific to the Tlingit, the Haida, Nupiaq, whoever is around them. And that will be written all over this curriculum that we adapt, because you'd be doing just as much harm if you otherwise. Regarding your first question and turning to the network, I think what I think about that LIME curriculum, it's so new for us, but what's really important to me to include from our partners, our Indigenous partners, are the history, particularly when I think of South and North America, and being able to point to what native ways of knowing that have existed for 10,000 years on these continents. So it's not directly from, but alluded to in the LIME curriculum as far as our history.
I don't know if you were related, like mentioning this, but I think that one important thing that I understand Mary was mentioning was there are also other ways of learning that is not only, sitting and listening to somebody talk and PowerPoints and all these things. And in this Indigenous program that I studied for my PhD, one of the things that the Indigenous students did was they will drink ayahuasca as part of the learning process, as recognizing that there are different ways of learning, there are different ways of understanding the connections that Martina is mentioning between the cell, the community, and nature. So that was something that, of course, there were also doctors who taught in this program that they were like, what is this, no? But as part of the program, they said, okay, we are going to be teaching Indigenous people, you also need to understand. And they were actually invited to participate in a ceremony, and they were just impressed, very impressed about that. So I think it's about recognizing that there are different types of knowledge, but there are also different types of learning, and that is I think one of the most challenging things to change. But I think it is important in the process of getting Indigenous knowledge and medical practices recognized.
Amelia, I think that's a great point that you bring up, and it's something that we talk about a lot. Is all knowledge is not taught in one school. It's a proverb we have, and I think coming from that Western medicine framework, it's something we really have to fight hard against when we're working with our students, because it's such a powerful framework, and and we have, if we really want to make a difference in the health of our people, that Western model hasn't been working for us. So we have to, it has to expand outward to incorporate other ways of knowing and learning and teaching too. So
I think the research is also showing that it doesn't work for Western students either. We're seeing that this curriculum that we've been teaching to all the students, not just the Indigenous students, they're learning it, but they're not holding on to it and they're not able to reapply it. So Dr. Lewis was just on this last call with us for the national curriculum. We realized that it has to have an experiential piece. Because if we don't include that, you know, akin to what you just talked about, Amalia, if we don't include that, we're not going to get much further than, yeah, they know our history now, finally. They should have learned it in high school, but here we go, you know, but we need so much more.
Yeah, and just to give a small example of the things that they did in this program. So they hired a traditional midwife, and they had also the OBGYN, and they made them teach the different ways in which each of them will learn, you know, the progress of the pregnancy, the location of the baby, the delivery process, and these young Indigenous people were exposed to listening to the OBGYN with all their diplomas and certificates, and also the midwife that have been doing this God knows for how many years, and learn from the elders through generations after generations. So it was very important for them as Indigenous people to be able to see the validity in practice of both approaches, you know, and yes, and that was, I think, very important that for them, no? So to make it, if they want to compare and not feel ashamed of their medical practices, to see how both of them, you know, contribute, and at the end of the day, they help the mother and the baby. You know?
I know a couple of Canadian examples is land-based teaching. There's quite a few across the country where they're taking the learners out to really, you know, to get immersed into the local. So I think the challenge is schools are like, well, how can we, when, you know, Indigenous populations are so diverse, how do we do this curriculum? And I think really it's about providing how to ask those questions, like how to connect with the communities, whether urban or reserve community, whatever it is, to say, how do we work with your community and your traditional medicine people or healers or Indigenous knowledge to make sure we're addressing your needs? And it's really about dismantling some of that fear that the West has about engaging, putting the foot in, not quite understanding. So it's about teaching sort of the mainstream how to respect, embrace, and ask questions so that they engage in a much better way and that the learner has a better experience. Students who have the experience, whether Indigenous or not, when they do experiential learning, land-based learning, that they never forget that. That's the thing they talk about 10 years later when they see you at a conference. They're like, oh, you know, Professor Soucy, remember this time? That's the stuff that really excites them and sticks. And I think that's pretty wonderful too, when that's what really resonates.
I always like to think of experiential learning. It kind of takes them out of this headspace where they are all the time, right? And it takes them more into sort of that heart and that spiritual space. And that's why that learning is so much more enriching.
I agree, but I think that Danielle, you know, when I think of what's happening in Canada and other places, I think that we need to really protect our communities, because I think a lot of our faculty are not where they need to be to interact in a good way with some of our communities. I certainly know plenty who are still, I just heard of a community member the other day who felt really harmed from my own class. So I think we need to tread lightly at the same time.
I think that's that difficulty in training that I was trying to allude to earlier as we kind of roll out sort of these more national things. Yeah, you're right. We have to really worry about protecting community and making sure that no harm happens as the two worlds sort of engage with each other. Yeah.
No, absolutely. You know, my own research is about non-Indigenous people teaching Indigenous health. And do they even feel competent to teach it? Do they have that understanding or background? Because you do hear the horror stories that come forward and the harm that is happening in learning environments. And certainly that's not where we want to end up. So absolutely respect what you're saying there.
And I wonder if we, every discipline, and if you think Indigenous medical education is a discipline, and every discipline needs its research. And I'm interested in the power, if you like, of the networks in supporting research, even, not even, maybe especially in comparative experiences that you've just described is one way, but also some of the other forms of research. I know, at least their names are there, although they might have gone to get coffee, but both Reese and David Paul are on the network, on the call, in terms of the work that we did a few years ago about some Tri-Nations work, and Martina generously hosted us in Hawaii, of course. But I'm wondering if you've got some ideas or some thoughts about how networks can strengthen the research that we need to further the Indigenous medical education work.
I'll start. I think the networks can be really helpful because some members of the networks, for example, have strengths in the area of research and academia that the rest of us may not. You know, many of us, for example, Mary and I were both clinicians for many years before we ventured into academia. So we don't have some of those same skills in doing research and writing and publishing that others do. Yet they're members of the network. I'm always amazed at the research that's coming out of for example, various members of the Lyme network. So I think that would be one way that we could really help and support each other as a network, because there's so much important work being done everywhere, but we're not always hearing about it. And unfortunately, it's because of our academic system wanting us to publish as a way to spread our knowledge. And, you know, which to me isn't a very Indigenous way to do it anyway. It's really talking story, right? And personal interaction, but it could be really helpful. I know for me, it could be really helpful. I'm sure for Mary, this is a new world, right? As far as, you know, what do you mean I need to publish, and, you know, I need to do statistical analysis on my programs, and what? So anyway.
Yeah, I agree. They said they liked it. What more do you need? No, the other benefit, I think, if we get enough of this research, you know, there just isn't much, even internationally, of Indigenous research, I don't believe. And if we get enough, then we can help prove things or demonstrate to academia. Look, community work is critical. It's not always framed the way as Western medicine would want us to frame research. But I feel like sometimes when I think about promotion that I'm never going to get ahead, because the work that we're doing, and we do plenty of work, is this intangible community work that's not as valued. So if we can start to get behind some of that, I think we're going to make it easier for more of us in academia to show this is what's powerful in our communities. This is what works. That's just one way. But I agree, Martina, appreciate that. You're already an associate, so I need all the lifting and pulling.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you need that kind of research data out there to justify funding, right?
Right.
And that's kind of the other kind of not so wonderful part of all this is budget and funding revolve around it.
It feels like we can help beat this competition down a little bit, though, if we start off by collaborating immediately, because there's so much competition, and it's going to be created even amongst us unless we beat them to the punch and start collaborating faster. I'm sorry, Amalia, you need more time.
No, I was just going to add that actually I felt that when Sean contacted me earlier last year when you were in the UK, he sent an invitation to discuss about how COVID-19 has been impacting Indigenous communities and how the media was or was not talking about it in different countries. I think those are the kind of research we can do, because, like, it sounds horrible, but I think COVID-19 has provided an opportunity to make it very virtual health disparities, health inequality, but also resiliency and the capacity of Indigenous leadership to face the challenges of COVID-19. Just like Martina was talking about climate change and how Indigenous knowledge suddenly is like, okay, you know, it's relevant. I think COVID-19 has presented the same challenge because Western science also didn't have an answer. And I am aware that in the Amazon, in different countries, you know, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, and I'm sure it was happening in other parts of the world, Indigenous people were resorting to their own knowledge with, you know, vapor to help the population with cleaning their, you know, all the symptoms, the respiratory symptoms, and providing care both for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who will go, you know, and seek for Indigenous healers for help. So maybe these are the opportunities that we should, you know, use to do what you're mentioning, Mary, you know, like bring together all these different examples to make a case about the relevance of this kind of efforts.
I think another important area is just good peer reviewers, right? If we're trying to publish, we're trying to get grants, and they're sending papers to someone because the credentials look appropriate. They have no conceptual understanding of anything Indigenous studies approaches. And they're saying, you know, no to your grant, no to your publication. So, you know, the network is important because you can say, no, here is a list of scholars that you can go to who will be critical, shred this appropriately, or yay or nay this work. And so I think the peer review network collaboration is just as important as a lot of the work that's going on.
And are there ways, do you think, Danielle, that the networks could more actively support that, or is that about the interconnection between the members of the networks?
I mean, I think most of us tend to talk to each other. We always connect, right? We have Lyme, we have Pride Act, we have different things, but it would be really good if we sort of all connected so that Mary knew who was doing what in Canada or in Peru or wherever. So there may be a way that our different networks can connect in the simplest way of sharing on our websites or within our organizations, a list of, you know, it's like a hit list of scholars. This is their specialty. If you need a peer reviewer or you need a letter for a grant or you're trying to do collaboration, here's who you go to, right? Very simple answer.
I think the other thing that I think that's an awesome idea, Danielle. And also it'd be nice to know who's looking at what, who's doing what research, because that might be a way to open the door for collaboration. So maybe you know, for example, Lyme could be a place that has a place where you house all the different members and what they're doing, and, you know, are they open to collaboration? Are they open to be a peer reviewer? Are they open to be an external reviewer for promotion or anything like that? Yeah. Great idea.
Very exciting.
Yeah. I think there's also people in the Lyme network that have done a lot of this, that have done a lot of publishing and research, and it'd be nice to know if some of them might be available just for one-on-one consults with us that are needing some support, or you know, to look this paper over, or what do you think of this idea? So you know, there may be a separate list of academics just available for kind of casual consult. Hey, can we Zoom meet for an hour to talk about this idea I have?
I think it's exciting to think about, you know, we know that research is now being reframed. There are new Indigenous research methodologies that have come out in the last 10, 20 years. I'm sorry, I'm still new to it. But what if we thought about if Lyme looked into or was monitoring for Indigenous ways to look at academia, all these different bodies and institutes that we're involved in? What if Lyme was watching out for people who are reframing all of it, and listing those, having a resource center for that, and being ahead and saying, hey, we can offer a conference on this, a new way to think about it, or a workshop.
Let's
like
pick
we're
up.
making a lot of work for Lyme.
Oh yeah, but you're hosting it, Martina. I see the outrigger is just reopened anyway, so we're fine. There's a couple of questions that we might pick up, and one's kind of actually about thinking through values and how we might imbue those values in the, I'm reframing the question, but how they might be imbued in the curriculum. And if I reflect on some of the work we did 20 years ago, actually all I was doing was in very many ways teaching Indigenous health from a burden of disease perspective and just kind of exacerbating the problem, which in many ways, I won't say made things worse, but wasn't empowering for students who didn't necessarily have a way forward. There's a problem, actually, it's a big problem. I can't remember who it was, it might have been you, Danielle, but in the opening comments an hour ago, you were talking about some of the Indigenous values that were imbued in part of the network and thinking through reciprocity and respect and family and so on. Have you got any ways that you've thought about that being included in curriculum and how that might be more a longer learning for students rather than just sets of data or those kind of things, how things are forgotten? It's a complex question and poorly articulated by me. Danielle?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that in case I understand. Knowing it's getting a bit later on the East Coast here, so the brain's a little slower. I think really it's that the context and the guidance, right? So we're talking about curriculum and the values of the land you're on and understanding the distinction of the land and the peoples, right? You know, where I am, there's 3 different nations, part of the Confederacy, well, similar, very different. And then you have your sort of travelers, right? You have people from the West in your territory. So it's not like everyone's in their home territory forever, everybody's traveling. So I think understanding how to learn about and respect the different approaches and how to ask those questions to make sure students are learning that it's okay to ask respectful questions. It's okay to be nervous. And it's important to be really uncomfortable if you're non-Indigenous, that you should be quite uncomfortable with a lot that you're learning, because that's going to be better learning for you in the long run. And really, you know, I'm a big fan of critical race theory and applying such a social science concept within medical education because it challenges that whiteness and it challenges values, it challenges core principles of your teaching philosophy, your school's philosophy, and it may be a way to look at things in a different ways, turning that lens backwards and saying, what are we doing? Or, you know, my fantasies, other the West, right? And see how that feels. So that when you walk into a meeting, I'll set the way that Indigenous have been expected to react for a long time. I'm sure I did not answer your question in any way, Sean.
I love that, other the West, Danielle. I think for me, as I try to make my way through that question, I think one of the things, and we talked about it already, right, is Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous knowledge, and making sure that we have strengths-based curriculum embedded into it. And, you know, I think the simplest thing that I found working with the students is reminding them that, for example, just using our own context, Native Hawaiians were scientists. All of our peoples were scientists. That's how we have thousands of years of this knowledge on how to work the land and all that. So, you know, so I try to give examples of, so for me, the easiest one is because our voyaging canoe got sort of international attention when Hokulea went around the world using just traditional wayfinding techniques. So I use that as an example. What is traditional wayfinding? And it's like, it's that power of observation, and it's making a hypothesis. And if that doesn't work, then you try something else and you see, and it's that whole scientific method, right? And that's something our people did. We were all scientists, and so I try to remind them of that as a way to sort of introduce strengths-based curriculum. I don't know if that kind of partially addressed what you asked, Sean.
You've both done a great job on a poorly articulated question on my part, and sorry for that, Gary. Martina, when we started, you raised the issue of a lack of critical mass in terms of Indigenous medical educators, even more so than perhaps Indigenous docs, but both have critical mass challenges. How has the panel worked with allies and colleagues to address this and think about who can teach what and how you approach that? And perhaps to the point of the panel, how you might use networks and around the globe to support your practice. Martina, how do you address the fact that there's you and Deanne?
Well, yeah, I know. I think this is a problem everywhere. There's interest. There are people that want to help, but there's a little discomfort in stepping into that space because of feeling like they're not comfortable in space, not wanting to make a mistake. So we have a couple of allies, but actually I must say for our teaching curriculum, we've had to go into other professions, but still tapping into Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. We have a few allies, and they tend to be people that are very social justice conscious. And so they're a little more comfortable. So that might be the first place to look for allies, are those that are pushing social justice issues in our institutions. And they may be the first ones that might be willing to help out because they understand that this is a challenge too. But yeah, honestly, we haven't actually honestly delved into trying to train allies to do like succession planning. Like if, for example, Deanna and I and a couple of us aren't there 1 year because of something, you know, who's going to do that work? We haven't done a good job of doing that. And maybe that's where development of a national curriculum would help, so that there's some basic guidelines and some resources that people can access. Yeah.
I've been told by a couple of the traditionalists here, and again, I'm in Anishinaabe country, that there's some strong feeling about not wanting non-Indigenous to teach our history and teach some of these things. And so it's, I've relied on, one, trying to find other Indigenous people from this area to help. Certainly they can explain the treaties, you know, they can explain some of the history and do those pieces just fine. So that works out. And then also that I've found that in my college, they've been taping my talks and giving them that way. I think the hardest part is going to be finding enough places for that experiential learning and getting people out to teach them some, you know, how we do things and recognize our different ways of doing without harming our community. Will be the bigger issue for us.
Thanks, Mary. Danielle, how do you think about this in terms of the National Consortium? Is that a shared space? You talked about Indigenous leadership before.
Yeah, the goal is to, you know, build Indigenous capacity, right? So one whole working group is about Indigenous faculty recruitment, retention, and not just as clinicians, but as people trained in, and this is my biases strictly coming out, in Indigenous studies, right? Like medicine knows medicine, it doesn't know Indigenous studies, and that doesn't know critical race theory and those type of thought processes that need to be put into the curriculum, because this helps address all the barriers that we know can stem from racism. I think obviously there's a role for allies, and I think it's, you know, as allies, our role is to take up space to create space. Like for the consortium, I'm here for 3 years, and I'm going to train my replacement who'll be Indigenous. And that's how the consortium really wants to build a cadre of Indigenous workers and scholars, our grad students, in terms of physicians, because we just don't have enough Indigenous medical educators and Indigenous physicians. It's also important that if there are good allies who are trained, that you work and support them, right? So we give them the tools so that we can do the work in a good way until such time that junior physicians and educators can take over. So, you know, making ways for good people to help, understanding that, you know, we're all part of a treaty relationship, and, you know, everyone needs to understand and make some changes, but just respect. I think it's that respect of knowing place and space, right? Your self-location as an ally within the work is really important.
Anyone else want to comment on this? Martina, did you have something else to say?
Yeah, I have one example of an ally that we use that has worked. We you know, it's so important to teach our history. And when we talk about the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, which is a very painful topic for a lot of us, we get quite emotional. And sometimes we've gotten pushback from students, right? You know, well, that happened 100 years ago, that wasn't me, you know, why? You know, don't blame me, you know, that kind of thing. And so one of the things we did was we actually had an ally teach about the overthrow that was an American military person that was teaching history at a local college, but was very well read and very passionate about Hawaiian history and what happened in the overthrow, and totally so could express our feelings and what the message we wanted to give, but yet he wasn't a threatening person. And that actually worked out for us. I've had, you know, I have had a couple Indigenous students I've gone through, go like, why is this non-Indigenous? And I'm like, because it's made it easier for the non-Indigenous to hear it and get it and not feel like they're being attacked by the Indigenous person who is having a hard time not getting emotional about talking about this topic. So that's just an example of where it can work, but you have to have the right ally. And this was the right ally. And we could totally mess it up by having the wrong one. So all the pieces have to be in place. So some of it is luck too, I think.
Thanks. We might change focus just a little bit. And think about, you know, we've got people from far and wide. Think a little bit about what an international network might look like, what might be the value, what might be the challenges, and you know, what some of the aspirations of an international network might be in this space. I'll just open that up to the panel and in no particular order.
I think that some of the benefits are a lot of what we've already talked about. We can show how this has already been done in other countries, you know, pushing of the curriculum. We can show the research that's being done in other areas. And we can, you know, I've learned already on this collaboration of different ways, like Martina's idea, when I think about it, is not that came across as talking down. I didn't mean it that way. I like your idea of having a Native person or a non-Native person who might represent a different view of that point of history done in a different way. And certainly we've had, it's painful for us, like teaching about missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country. So, you know, we're already learning from each other. So there are so many benefits. I don't know that I could name them all of an international collaboration. Really appreciate being part of this.
I think we're small in number, but by collaborating together, we could have a huge impact. And that's the benefit.
I also think that one important thing of having an international network is the idea that not only that we can learn from each other, but that we can also connect the dots and identify, like in an academic, like from an academic perspective, maybe the concepts that we're using, you know, how to make them more clear, you know, how to talk about certain things in a way that you know, we can, you know, say the same things and connected with, you know, history, discrimination, and being comfortable saying it. You know, I am not an Indigenous person, for example. I would consider myself an ally. Of course, in Latin America, it's not so clear as, you know, white and Indigenous people, because the majority of non-Indigenous people are actually brown skin. So it is a different context, but I think it is important. You know, I think that what you are saying is regarding having allies, and regarding how who can talk about certain things, and how and what advantages they will give that person is important, but also the concept that we're using. Like, for example, you know, cultural safety, cultural competence. We use the term intercultural health, you know, decolonizing, you know, education, understanding Indigenous ways of learning, understanding that healing is not about, you know, I had an Indigenous student in my class here in the US who wrote to me saying, you know, what I did, like, she was Navajo, and she told me that she had been learning how to dance, and that in the class she realized, oh, you know, I'm also participating of a healing process, but she never opened up in the class. She sent me an email. So I think that that is something important, to have a safe place to share, but also to problematize the concepts and the ways in which we want to talk about these kind of things.
Amalia, earlier you mentioned that there was some particular helpful elements to the networks around some of the COVID responses that you'd seen, particularly in Peru. Do you want to just touch on them for a moment?
Yes, so I was remembering the Zoom meeting we had, I can't remember when, but with people from different parts of the world who were either Indigenous or who were working with Indigenous populations. And I remember one of the things that I found that was common was that there's still the historic experience of past epidemics, you know, in the, you know, the elders and everything, and how this idea of isolation and closing your territories and protecting yourself and your community was something common. You know, people in New Zealand were talking about that. I think there were colleagues from Finland, and that's the same thing that was done in the Amazon. It gives you a sense of, you know, the role of history in the way people face new, you know, not so new for Indigenous people, but this kind of health challenges. So I think that was very relevant to hear that it was something that was happening with Indigenous populations in many parts of the world. You know? That was one important thing that I you know, remember feeling when we had this meeting, and the relevance of these international networks to think about these processes and experiences.
Just taking the whole topic of COVID and the impact of networks, I think for our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander population, it really was all about networks. So when COVID first hit the US, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders were being impacted, and still are being impacted disproportionately, some of the highest rates in the country still in many states in the US. But it started with a network of physicians kind of talking to each other, going, hey, how come I'm seeing this in my community? Are you seeing that in your community? And then getting community to get riled up about that, and then different community organizations talking to each other, and then formally organizing, saying, we're so small in number, nobody's going to pay attention to us, so we've got to do something about this and make this situation heard. And so that networking from healthcare provider to healthcare to community organizations up to, you know, academia and policy and departments of health and stuff. So that was a very powerful network to see happen. And then it spread, you know, across the country. So we started, you know, our network in Hawaii connected with the Pacific Islander network on the US, and now we're sharing resources because, for example, there's so many languages, it's hard to do a lot of informational things with all these languages, and so we're sharing. But it was just a wonderful wonderful way to see how networking can work really quickly in a short period of time. So, you know, our Hawaii network was up and running within within a month of the word getting out, less than a month of the word getting out that Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders were being hit hard. And we were actually the first to disaggregate NHPI and then disaggregate Asians. And so it's the power of small voices pushing hard. And so now you're seeing that emphasis on disaggregation happening with some of the other states as well. But, you know, a non-medical education example of power of networking.
Sean, if I might just ask a question or two.
Great, thanks, Lilon.
So thank you. For the participants, I'm Lilon Bandler, and I work in the Lyme network and have a long association with Lyme. And I guess this goes to the heart of what I've thought about for a long time, and really this is to all of the panel, but Martina and Danielle, you in particular, both had a long list of activities to undertake. And I guess I wondered how you make decisions about what you work on today and whether or not that's reactive, you know, what can we have some influence on today? Or do you have a sense of one thing being more important and being essential to baseline work before you can move on?
Danielle and I are both waiting for each other to go first. You want to go first, Danielle? You know, in this COVID world, I have to be honest, it's been very reactive. Curriculum has changed because of COVID. So for example, the whole racism thing, you know, sort of Black Lives Matter and COVID sort of all collided at the same time. And so all of a sudden there's all this, now is the time, I think, I forget, was it Mary? If you said, now is the time that we have to take advantage of what's happening in our country. And there's a focus on racism. And now we have to, this is when we're gonna like do all our curriculum and it's gonna get inserted and buy-in by everybody. So a lot of the work right now has been very reactive. Prior to COVID, we were trying to be much more methodical about what are our priorities and how are we going to do this. And for us at UH, we had to do little pieces at a time. So it was like, what's the most important piece? Now, what's the next most important piece that we want the students to have to be the physicians that we want them to be for our people? So that was more methodical, but everything's been upended and now everything's changed and we're really focusing on some of these other issues. Yeah. I don't know which way is better or not, but that's the world we're in now.
Yeah, I think and thought out. We have, you know, the executive, the plan for the consortium has been well thought out, the direction of the part, you know, the 6 working groups, it's like simultaneous, all are important, all need focus, and hence a consortium, right? Because our executive are the doctors who are often public health officials who are doing all that COVID work. But we're also a bit reactive. We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? And that motivated people. And sadly, we've had a lot of really horrific racism in healthcare. We had George Eshwan live stream basically her death at the hands of poor healthcare in Quebec, a province here in Canada. And that's really gotten attention of people. So unfortunately, we're like sort of driven by tragedy in the sense of at least people are listening because of tragedy. We've had, unfortunately, with the residential schools and the children being found, these are sort of catalysts to get, unfortunately, people engaged for the wrong reasons in a sense that they're reactionary, but we have to be strategic and use that opportunity to push through as much as we can because it won't be hot in a while. People won't care, right? It'll slow down and then it's back to sort of that push-pull through the system. So, I mean, the work has been the same and constant. The same people have been working hard. but they're strategic and smart, and we have to sort of respond to sort of those topics, whether, you know, sort of nauseatingly the cause, but we have to tap into it. So it's a bit of both, you know, reactive and strategic.
And Mary, did you want to?
I was going to say the exact same thing, that yes, that inserting the curriculum right now, it feels reactionary, but it's something we've been wanting to do for a long time. It's just that now we have to push faster, harder while we have this window, the little tiny window that's going to close again, right? But we are doing proactive at the same time. This meeting to me is proactive right now. I think, you know, I approached Danielle and said to her earlier this year, before their effort kicked off in a big way, and said, can the United States and Canada come together to form our own Lyme-like model? Those are proactive. The AAIP, Association of American Indian Physicians, is looking forward to its 50th anniversary in Washington, D.C. next year, and hopefully to grow our collaboration beyond just physicians, because as Martina points out, there are not nearly enough of us, to nurses, PAs, dentists, everything we need, which basically is everything. So a lot of that is proactive. At the same time, we're doing this reactive work, as Danielle nicely pointed out.
I have one other question, which, you know, is, I guess, because I'm conscious of the fact that we have a lot of educators in our participant group. And I guess, you know, Martina, you mentioned that you being away means who does the work? How do we sort of quarantine time? And I recall Professor Pittermer talking about the competition for space in the learning and teaching timetable in medical education, and how there were some very highly competitive specialties. And I wondered if you could each talk a bit about how difficult it is to get yourself curriculum space, and how do you protect it? How can you sort of, you know, apart from being there, Martina, how can you make sure that you don't lose that curriculum space? And you're muted.
That's a great question. For us, and I've shared my story at Lyme before. It's kind of like a lava flow, and you start slowly adding land. You just kind of keep adding to it. So it's every little piece we get, we hang on to it, and so that's how we've built. Is we just hang on to it, and if somebody else, and you have to have the leadership support. So I haven't ever had anybody ask to take some of our time away. I have had bottles for more time because, you know, anatomy wants more time, you know, physiology, you know, everybody wants more time. None of us have enough time in the curriculum. So it's really hard. I think I don't know, it's kind of funny with our gang. It's like, okay, they're giving us this time, we're going to hang on to it. Okay, they gave it to us last year. When are they giving it to us this year? You know, and it's like not letting them forget that they give us time so we can add to it. But our way is not the way I would recommend.
Well, I don't know. I really like the idea of a lava flow, actually. I find that hugely attractive. And the way it might burn everything in its course, you know, I'm really taken with that idea.
Yeah, and it just gets stronger, right? Each layer that comes after reinforces the one below it, so it gets stronger, and that land gets more solid. So that's kind of the way it's been for us, but it's definitely the hard way to do it and a slow way to do it. And the way is to get the AAMC, for example, in the US, to say you have to teach this, and then the medical schools have to make room in the curriculum, and of course we're going to design it so it's longitudinal and vertical, so they don't only get it in one little period. It's going to keep getting reinforced in subsequent years. So I think that's actually the way to do it. It's a bigger battle right now to get that, but I think that's the best answer.
One thing that I've been working on lately with that experiential learning, and I think it's funny, it brings me back to you, Leland, in talking about economic models. We had a little chat offline. And I think about, I want to expose these students to what it looks like to live on the other side of the track, all these medical students. And in doing so, I'm going to give them some insight into some people in my community. In fact, a good 40% in some areas, right? So doubling up on some opportunities. It's not necessarily Indigenous per se, but certainly plenty of the community that I'm fighting for are experiencing some of those same battles. So that's one way. The other way is to have it be your school's mission, like my school's. So then it's a little bit easier after Dr. Melissa Lewis barged the way through.
Yeah. And curriculum really, like Mary pointed out, has to have experiential. I don't see how we'll be able to teach Indigenous health and have anybody really understand it without that experiential component. That's really, really critical.
I still remember when you cut your foot on the fish ponds, Martina. Can we ask, thanks for those extra questions, Lilon, and we might just ask the panel for some closing comments, if any. We've focused broadly on the value of networks, how they've impacted the work that we do more broadly. And Danielle, if I can head over your way just for some closing comments, and we'll just go around the panel before we finish the session.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think this is a perfect example of the importance of networks, is the discussion we had tonight. We've all been doing this for a long time, but I know I learn in here every time I have conversations with colleagues like yourselves. And I think, you know, the importance of networks is there's power in it, right? There's still that sort of, we're still in a colonial time where division is the goal. And when we show unity within the networks, then this is where change happens, because it can't be, well, it's little unheard of. It's like, no, it's happening in Australia, in Aurora, in Hawaii, in Peru. It's happening across the globe. There's no more reasons why not to. Certainly, you've raised a lot of this group, some amazing questions and lots to think about and to take back to NCIME and the team. And really, I think, you know, it's just part of an ongoing conversation, and I look forward to more, and I'm certainly been very grateful to share this space with everyone this evening. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Danielle. Amalia?
For me, also, I think that the networking is an opportunity for sharing, but also for realizing that there are common struggles, maybe different strategies, and maybe even, you know, different contexts, but that there are experiences out there that we should, you know, like, these are opportunities for sharing, for learning, and for realizing that there's a lot of work to do, but that, you know, there are opportunities to do them together, you know, and to build something together. And from learning, for example, from the Light Network, there's an example, and maybe we can follow those steps and do maybe something different, but with the same, you know, I would say, like, soul in it. So for me, this has been a great experience, and thank you for inviting me, and thanks everybody.
Thanks, Amalia. Mary?
I think it's interesting. We just started to pull together from AIP this idea of Canada joining, and then invited Lyme into our conversation. And then next thing I know that I'm invited to this panel. So I can't tell you how exciting it is to see this start to spread to other areas besides those who have benefited for so long, and to share your knowledge. Also, anytime that I get on a group of other Indigenous people, other Indigenous leaders, it's just empowering to know that we're finally seeing some changes happening for our communities. I will go back to Martina's words, and you know, the whole reason to do this, the reason we started in the United States, is that we are tiny populations now, thanks to history and some terrible things happening. But when we bind together, we are far more powerful. And so I'll leave it at that. Miigwech Gunash Chish for inviting me.
Thanks so much, Mary. And Martina.
Okay. Mahalo nui loa for pulling this panel together. I want to really mahalo Lime for all your hard work, for being a source for inspiration and a resource for all of us as we continue our work. And I welcome the opportunity to strengthen the connection with Lime in our country. Also, you know, I just want to be just thankful for the people that you brought together, and I'm looking forward to the great things that are going to be coming.
Thanks, Martina, and can I thank all of the panel, all four of you, plus you for piping in as well, Lilon, with those great questions. Some fantastic work happening really across the areas that we're coming from: South America, North America, the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand. So that was there's lots to take out of that session, and you can find people via email. You can connect with other conference delegates via their contact emails from the password protected page if you've registered at Lime Connection. And I say that because I think there's probably quite a few ideas or connections that people might want to be engaged with that have come out of this conversation as well. So please do that. So thanks again to our panelists at different times across the planet. One of the things that was raised was funding, and surveys help describe the value for funders. It also helps us do our job better. So please, if you can, do the very short survey now. We've set aside a few minutes to do that before there's the opportunity for some further online chat if you want to. And whilst you are doing the survey, can I just acknowledge the support from the funders and the people that have supported the connection in very many ways. Lime being funded through the Commonwealth Department of Health in Australia, Medical Deans Australia, New Zealand, and Te Ora. And then there's the list of sponsors on the page there. As you're doing that short survey, again, given we're all quite disconnected, there's the Twitter and the Facebook and the Insta sites of #LimeStayingConnected. And if you've got good things to say and nice screenshots of lots of smiling faces, please do share all of that.